opposite of credible, something that isn't believable. But that's not what incredible means, is it? Incredible means going beyond belief. It's beyond something you could have believed in. Now, isn't that interesting? Because belief may set expectations, or there may be expectations or limits on what you feel you can believe in. And incredible, something that's incredible goes beyond those limitations. So it's an interesting wordplay, and I don't have any I don't have any conclusions to draw here right now. It's just a meditation, and just something interesting to think about, and maybe will take your mind off of some of the really difficult things that we are hearing in the news right now. It certainly helped me take that step back that I talk about. And to look at things from a higher perspective. All right, my goodness. I went a little further with that one than I wanted to do, but our topic today is about the mystical experience. And the reason I chose that topic is because last week I mentioned how there were experiments using, credible scientifically credible experiments using psychedelics that used to be reviled and are still made illegal, but are now being used to help patients have what basically is a mystical experience to help them heal, which is basically high-tech shamanism, because that is exactly what shamans have done for millennia. So I just think it's fascinating and wonderful, and that's why I keep coming back to this topic. But people were very interested in that. They wanted to know, because I explained an experience I had. They wanted to know, what is the mystical experience? What is it like? And of course, the paradox here is that the mystical experience is something that is virtually unexplainable in the language that we have. And anytime you ask someone who's had one, it's incredibly hard for them to describe. I'd say that you know it when you've had one, or at least you suspect it. And what generally happens when you have one of these experiences, and what might make it different from simply a dream or hallucination, is that it tends to be so powerful that it changes your life. It changes your life on a deep, deep level. Not just the kind of level where, you'd say, I think it's time to get a new job, or I think I'm going to move to a new city, or or get a new house, or something like that. It goes much deeper than that. It's a change, a fundamental shift in how you are looking at your life. That's what a mystical experience often does. So I want to share with you some people who have had mystical experiences who would like to talk about them. As far as myself, in relation to mystical experiences that I've had, It's been cumulative in that it has expanded my vision of things, or the way that I think of things. And over time, it has changed me. And that's the best way that I can put it. So I'm going to talk about a couple of people here who have been involved in this experimenting about psychedelics. And this comes from that book that I've been telling you about, How to Change Your Mind, by Michael Pollan. And he's talking about three men who are largely responsible for this sort of renaissance of research in the use of psychedelics. And along the way, it's not just the use of psychedelics they're looking at. This is really the first that I can recall straight up, full-on scientific investigation on the mystical experience, on mystical experiences. There have been others that have looked at how the brain responds to them. But the assumption by traditional science is that consciousness is, whatever it is located in the brain somewhere. It's something that's part of our brain and has to do with synapses and serotonin. And this is an exploration on a different kind of theory about consciousness, that it isn't in our brains. But okay, let me go ahead and share this with you, and then you can hear what I'm talking about. So this is about Dr. Griffiths. This is the man, Roland Griffiths, who began this study of psychedelics. And this is an explanation on how he got there. Because before this, he had been working as a scientist at Johns Hopkins, and working with grants from the National Institute on Drug Abuse. His biggest contribution was to be able to look at how caffeine affected the human body and the human mind, and the addictive properties of caffeine. And his research on this, which was about apparently about 55 papers he published on it, began to change how we view caffeine, and allowed us to see it as less than a food and more of a drug. And also really introduced or defined the phenomena of caffeine withdrawal, which everybody who's had a lot of coffee knows, but now there is an actual listing of it as a mental disorder in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, and that's largely due to the work of Mr. Griffiths. And he was a scientist at the top of his game in his field, but then he began to experiment with yoga, Siddha yoga, to be exact. And despite his behaviorist orientation as a scientist, he had always been interested in what philosophers call phenomenology. That's the subjective experience of consciousness. He said that he had tried meditation as a graduate student, but found that he couldn't sit still for any period of time without going, as he says, stark raving mad. But he tried it again in 1994, and he says something opened up for me, and he began meditating regularly. He also began going on retreats and working his way through a lot of different Eastern spiritual traditions. In other words, he became a spiritual seeker, like many of my listeners on this program are involved in. And he found himself drawn deeper and deeper into this mystery. And then he says he had a funny kind of awakening, a mystical experience. Mr. Pollan, in writing this book and interviewing Mr. Griffiths, says that he was surprised that Griffiths mentioned this when they had their first meeting. And he tried to follow up on it, but Mr. Griffiths was pretty reluctant to say much about what this experience was about. All he would tell me, Pollan says in his book, all he would tell me is that the experience, which took place in his meditation practice, acquainted him with something way, way beyond a material worldview that I can't really talk to my colleagues about because it involves metaphors or assumptions that I'm really uncomfortable with as a scientist. So this meditative experience put him in direct conflict with his spiritual side, or his spiritual side became, or his scientist side, let's say it that way, this scientist side felt in conflict with his spiritual side because he couldn't reconcile the two. It's hard to do when you've been, brought up in to believe things in a certain way. So that's why mystical experiences are really hard to explain. They go beyond the credible and take you into the incredible. So Pollan goes on in his book to say that in time, what he was learning about the mystery of consciousness and existence in his meditation practice came to seem more compelling to him than his science. And he began to feel alienated. None of the people I was close to had any interest in entertaining these questions. This is what Griffiths is saying. And this fell into the general category of the spiritual and religious people I just didn't get. Here I am, a full professor, publishing like crazy, running off to important meetings and thinking I was a fraud. So he began to lose interest in the research that he'd been doing his whole life. He says, I could study a new sedative hypnotic, learn something new about brain receptors, be on another FDA panel, go to another conference, but so what? I was more emotionally and intellectually curious about where the other path might lead. And my drug research began to seem vacuous. I was going through the motions at work, much more interested in going home in the evening to meditate. That's kind of how a spiritual experience works. Gradually makes you see things differently and can change your value system. The only way he could think to motivate himself to continue writing grants was to think of it as a service project for his graduate students and postdocs. And about these dimensions in consciousness that meditation opened up for him, he said, it never occurred to me that there was any way to study it scientifically. He began to get stymied and bored, and he began to entertain thoughts of quitting science and going off to an ashram in India. And that's when he got a call from a friend of his named Bob Schuster. Now, Bob Schuster was the head of the National Institute on Drug Abuse. And he suggested that Griffith talk to a man by the name of Bob Jesse. Jesse had organized a small gathering of researchers, therapists, and religious scholars